Hi, Nakul. Thanks for joining me this very suddenly because we've just heard yesterday we were sitting and recording another show, and at that time the KKR game was called off, and today we've just heard the IPL's been suspended indefinitely. Those were the words used. Initial reaction?
Well, this has come about because there have been positive cases confirmed in at least three, potentially four of the franchises. It was always going to be the case that what was going to force the suspension of the tournament was breaches in the bubble and a loss of confidence in the bubble. This is what has happened with international tours. It's what happened with the PSL this year and last year. And once it got to this stage, there was really no other option but to suspend the IPL. They've used the word suspend indefinitely. They are leaving open the possibility of picking it up again at another time later in the year, potentially in another part of the world or in a different parts of India. Whether that's going to happen, I don't know. The you're starting to get into elements of clashing with other parts of the international calendar, but certainly for the next little while, there is not going to be an IPL, and the players. The priority now has to be to get all the players and staff and officials and ground staff home safely, so that they're not exposed, and so that where they're going to doesn't become at risk of COVID exposures either. This wasn't inevitable. There were lots of options being talked about yesterday. Possibility of the tournament relocating to Mumbai. This didn't have to have happened necessarily, and I don't think it's a case of necessarily of that. I've seen a lot of people almost slightly gleeful of saying, this is what the BCCI and the IPL had coming to it. While I understand the desire and the very real damage that the BCCI do to the world game by their power games, that is not the reaction that is proportionate to the situation here. It is not inevitable that this happened, but once it did happen, and once the bubble was breached so significantly, and multiple bubbles across multiple cities were breached so significantly, there was no prospect of the IPL continuing.
Yeah, I think coming to the tribal nature of people, like you said, some people rejoicing the fact that the IPL has been called off, and I find that really hard because there are a lot of players who take part in the IPL who actually don't have international contracts and actually don't make a lot of money, and they look forward to the IPL as that major income bringer to them. And I'm sure this will take an economic hit on them. And I think some people tend to forget as well that there's livelihoods at stake. The people that IPL employ who will be affected by the IPL being called off. And I don't think there's any cause for celebration. So I think those people need to introspect and see for themselves as well what are they celebrating. I just don't understand. It brings
I
some people though, like example, if you're in India right now, and I'm not speaking for everyone else, but I know from my family, there's so much, obviously whatever's happening in India is so bad, but then when you watch the IPL for 3 hours, it's like an escape. You tend to forget what's happening around the world, and I think that also being taken away from people who love cricket and who love the IPL is also going to be a huge impact there as well.
Yes, of course. It's all of the reasons that sport is important. It's the most important of the least important things. It does provide a little point of light and something that you can lose yourself in and take seriously. There's a joy in taking things seriously that aren't serious and don't ultimately matter. It elevates life from existence, and without the the continuing in the continuation of the IPL could only be a minor thing in terms of alleviating how people are feeling and how people are getting through this acute COVID crisis that's engulfed India right now. But it was something, uh, and look, but as I say, that isn't reason enough to for it to keep going. Though once it got to the case where multiple bubbles in multiple cities were being breached, there was no prospect of the IPL continuing, and the decision has been made quickly. It has been made definitively, and the players know that they're not going to be hanging around for a week to see what happens. They're not going to be in hotel room isolation for a week, waiting for news, not knowing if they're going to keep playing or if they're going to be going home to their families, whether that's within India or elsewhere. They plans can now start to be put in place to get players home. It'd be There's two things that come out of that I'm quite interested in. One is the emerging Indian players, the ones who aren't on very high contracts, and the ground staff and the officials, those domestic Indian officials, people who have to go back to parts of India, who are potential COVID risks themselves, going back to their communities, and also are at risk going home. How much support are the BCCI going to give them, because they are in a much more vulnerable position than some? And then the second one is the Australian players, who we know Australia has imposed a really draconian piece of legislation about Australian citizens, not just people coming in from India to Australia, Australian citizens returning from India, with massive fines and potential 5-year jail terms. And now, what negotiations are going on between the IPL, the BCCI, the Australian Cricketers Association, Cricket Australia, and the Australian government, I have no idea. And I've been following the Australian press and those who do know the situation a bit more closely, with some interest to see what happens there. Whether there's some exemptions made, whether while the ban is in place, there are some county contracts arranged for them hastily so they can play and maintain their livelihoods and do something useful in England for a few months. Who knows whether that is going to be the case or not? But those two groups of players and groups of people. It's not just players; it's the ground staff and the officials as well. Those players need to be taken care of.
Yeah. Just a thought that's come to me on a slightly lighter note, just on that. If some of the Aussie cricketers who can't get a county contract, imagine if they just ended up staying in India with their like teammates at their houses, because they obviously can't go back to Australia. It'd be like, in school when you have sleepovers and you just have friends over. I know it's a
For
tough situation, but I mean, imagine David Warner doing a TikTok with Yuzvendra Chahal in his house. That'd be interesting, wouldn't it?
that seems almost the least safe option, to be honest. For those players, they'd be better off staying in the hotels, um, from a COVID safety point of view. Yeah, from the sort of sitcom point of view of a bunch of Australian players suddenly rooming with or staying as long-term house guests with Indian players, that might be quite an amusing situation to think about. But I don't see that. That's not going to happen. They'll, as I say, the repatriation effort. I mean, there were already negotiations going on, and it'll be interesting to see how those develop. And I'll be following that situation closely.
Yeah, and obviously coming back to the IPL breach, yesterday when news came out, bubble breach, yesterday when the news came out that Varun Chakravarti and Sandeep Warrior tested positive, KKR were quick to say that it was that when they went to the hospital, they contracted COVID, even though they were wearing PPE kits and they've been isolated since. Then Chennai Super Kings news came out, the three of their staff had tested positive. But now, today, when Sunrisers, Riddhiman Saha tested positive and Amit Mishra tested positive for Delhi Capitals, there's actually no indication of how they contracted COVID. And so there's clearly indications of a bubble breach, which I feel made the players lose faith in the bubble. And that is predominantly the reason the IPL has been suspended indefinitely.
Once that faith in the bubble is gone, there's no point. In terms of the players and officials, and in the Chennai case, a member of the crew preparing the team bus, Varun Chakravarti and Sandeep Warrior went for scans. And what's meant to happen, as has happened with, I think, Natarajan at the Sunrisers, what's meant to happen is that they isolate upon their return from hospital. That procedure didn't happen. That procedure wasn't followed. So that seems to be how that happened. With Chennai, we don't know. There's a lot of rumors flying around, which I'm not gonna lend credence to, because I simply don't know the facts. And yeah, we don't know what happened with Riddhiman Saha and Amit Mishra. We do know that some members of the Delhi ground staff crew also tested positive, but none of them were in attendance over the weekend. Bear in mind that with the IPL now having place in two cities, there are some teams based in Delhi, some teams based in Ahmedabad. So there is the possibility of one team in Delhi getting a case and then it's spreading, or vice versa in Ahmedabad. We simply don't know, and those questions are going to have to be answered, and there's going to have to be a fairly exhaustive audit and inquest as to how this happened. Not so much about punishment, but about learnings for future, because it's not impossible that the major tournaments are going to have to happen during times where bubbles are necessary. I mean, the T20 World Cup, for example, later this year. We still don't know where it's going to be played, but either India or,
Yeah, that
as
was my next
increasingly
question to
likely,
you.
the UAE.
Yeah, that was my next question to you, was about the T20 World Cup, with obviously the COVID situation being bad in India as it is right now, and the World Cup's scheduled for October. Do you reckon I've been reading rumors that the BCCI already has contingency plans to host the T20 World Cup in UAE. Do you think that's the option that should be taken, and or the World Cup should be called off, in your opinion?
I don't think calling it off is the right answer. It's already been postponed once. Um, if you're calling it off, there's no window for it because there's one next year. So you're going to push that back again as well? No, that would be a disaster. Um, there are so many countries around the world who rely on ICC tournaments for the bulk of their revenues, and frankly, it's a World Cup. It's a big deal, and it should be treated as such. This is uh, you can't just move them around indefinitely like this. They're flagship tournaments, and they deserve to be treated as such. Um, as far as the IPL, the World T20 happening in the UAE, that is the contingency plan, and that's been made public by the BCCI and the ICC. I'm not going to try and predict what's going to happen between now and October in terms of COVID cases in India. A few months ago, we didn't think it was going to get this bad in India, as far as we knew. Although, as it turns out, a lot of the scenarios and that were being painted were over optimistic, to say the legally least, as they were being presented by the Indian government. But we don't know at this stage simply what the situation is going to be come September when play and October when players start arriving for the UAE. There'll be for that tournament in India. There'll be a cut-off, as it were. There'll be a point beyond which it can't be moved because it'll be too logistically difficult. So that decision has to be made at some point, potentially sort of mid-September or so. I'll try and firm up the timeline from people who know the ins and outs of these things. The UAE would be a reasonable fallback option for the IPL. I keep saying that. Sorry, for the T20 World Cup for the ICC and the BCCI, and that's why it's being discussed. So I can't honestly give you an answer as to what will happen.
And would player trust in the bubble again in India if the World Cup happens in India? Would that be paramount to that decision whether the T20 World Cup happens in India or in the UAE?
It has to be a factor. Obviously, it would be the ICC arranging the bubble this time rather than the BCCI and the IPL. What the bubble worked for a couple of weeks, or a month or so, and if it turns out that it was people not following the procedures that caused the breach, then that is a little bit more cause for optimism in a sense from the BCCI. It says that the measures in place were strong enough if people had followed them. We don't know that whether that's the case. Clearly, there's a lot of time between now and then for the COVID situation to improve, or for the scars of the bubble breach to be less fresh. There's too many moving factors to really speculate right now as to what's going to happen with that. But the players have to be, and the team's staff and all of the support staff at the various venues, they've got to be secure in the knowledge of that they're going to be okay and in a position to play good cricket, psychologically and mentally, and in terms of training days and all of these factors. For the teams who are taking part in the T20 World Cup, many of whom are not, certainly in the case of the ones going into the qualifying tournament and the lower some of the lower ranked test playing nations, are not as well paid and are not as well remunerated, and need the centralized resources and the centralized organization to be absolutely rock solid uh, that is going to be a factor in whether the tournament can go ahead. I mean, obviously there are also financial factors. Is it more financially viable to host a tournament in the UAE with fans against a tournament in India without fans, for example? Who knows whether that is going to be the case or not? I mean, ticket revenues make up a small fraction of the percentage of revenue of any given world tournament. It's primarily about TV revenue and broadcast revenue, but it's not nothing, and it is a better televisual product, of course, for there to be fans there. Massively speculating now. We just don't know any of the answers to these questions, and there's no way we can know at this stage.
Yeah, and moving away from the T20 World Cup back to the IPL, they say suspended indefinitely, which leaves a little glimmer of hope for doing it later in the year, finishing up the tournament, similar to what happened with the Premier League when it first got suspended last year. Do you see that as a possibility, or do you think that there's too many challenges logistically, especially with bringing players back and the tight schedule that cricket runs, that the IPL will not probably go on? Uh,
Bringing players back, I don't think is necessarily the issue. The schedule is. The last year it happened in October, November during the window for what was meant to be the 2020 World Cup. T20 the T20 World Cup was meant to happen last year. That's obviously been postponed to this year, and as I said, I don't think they can move it again. Or if they do, it's going to be an almighty political wrangle between the ICC and the BCCI, one that could have serious ramifications for cricket, which is not impossible. Certainly, when sort of Ganguly took over at the BCCI as president, he almost declared war on the ICC in statements before he took over. There's been a real aggressive push by the BCCI in the last couple of years to as they see it, gain back some of the power, or more realistically, hold on to the power that they had taken and that the ICC was trying to claw back for itself as the representative of the world game. So it's not impossible that could happen. That will get really ugly if that were the case. The schedule is a factor. There's no real possibility of it happening this summer, given that the World Test Championship is happening in mid-June, and then India are in England for a tour, which is a flagship tour, and there are lots of other international commitments happening. This spring window is the only real window of the tour of the year where the IPL is this is where the IPL is meant to happen, because it infringes with the least other international cricket. I know that there is some, but it's not as packed. October, November is a busy time internationally for a lot of teams. You frequently get 2 or 3 test matches going on at once. This year there's a World Cup happening. There's lots of tours going on, so it does get tight. They've left themselves open to the possibility of it happening again, which I think is understandable caution at this stage, and they want for it to happen, for the second half of the tournament to happen in some capacity. When that can be or where that can be, I honestly couldn't tell you at this point.
yeah, and finally, just before we end, are we sparing a thought for Royal Challengers Bangalore? They finally looked like a team that had their combination set. They finally got a good balance between batsmen and bowlers. And it's almost like Liverpool last season before the football came back on, that you see a team that's finally got together and you can see them winning that league they've thought of winning for so many years. And then obviously this unfortunate incident with the pandemic happens. And do you almost spare a thought for them? Of course, we know safety comes first, but from a team perspective, what they've built, do you feel bad with the mega auction coming up, which means they'll have to rebuild again?
You have to feel for the teams and the players, and players who are in great form. Harshal Patel or Avesh Khan, guys who are breaking through, and others as well. I mean, Parakal had already kind of broken through, but there are others out there who are having great seasons and having breakthrough seasons and really making a name for themselves. And yeah, it's a very it's a very RCB thing to happen in some ways. They finally get it together, and then the tournament gets cancelled or postponed indefinitely, rather. yeah, you know, the from a flippant sort of jokey point of view, yes, you that's all well and good. But yeah, you have to feel for a lot of the players, and you know, speaking from my own perspective, very limited, and obviously as a drop in the ocean, relatively speaking. I was going to get some work out of this IPL, some commentary work, and that's not now happening. And there's lots of people who are, as you said earlier, whose livelihoods are directly affected by the fact that the IPL can't go ahead now, or the second half of the IPL can't go ahead now, and there is a human cost to all of this, and but the once the bubble was breached, once the bubbles were breached in Delhi and Ahmedabad, and once that confidence in the bubble was lost, there was really no option but to stop the IPL, and I'm glad that the BCCI and the IPL have come together and done that quickly.
Yeah, and I'm hopeful that they will also take care of the players and make sure that they get home safely, because I know for a fact that a lot of IPL teams take pride in the fact the way that they treat their players. Where even when they get injured, I'm a KKR fan, so I know when KKR players get injured, the team pays for them to get operated on and takes care of them, sends them wherever they need to go. And I'm sure these teams will also come together and make sure that their players get home safe. At
It
least
was
I'm
a major
hoping that.
it was a major part of the statement, and this got said last week as well, that the BCCI will do everything in its power to make sure that players get home to their homes and their families safely, wherever that is, whether that's negotiating with foreign countries' governments and so forth with overseas players, or state governments, and ensuring that there are facilities and ways that players based in India can go home safely, particularly those who aren't on large contracts. Forget national contracts or state contracts. I mean, for what it's worth, actually, a lot of state players haven't been paid for a while, so there's that factor as well. And you know, what do you do with the rest of the player payments? You know, for the rest of the tournament that are going to happen, is there insurance in place to ensure that players aren't out of pocket through something that's not of their making? But teams do take player welfare fairly seriously. Another example, when in 2014, Jasprit Bumrah needed a knee reconstruction, and I think he'd just broken into the Mumbai Indians team at that time. Mumbai Indians took really good care of that, and they basically managed that process. They got him world-leading surgery, and he wasn't a major part of their team at the time, and his career could have been ended at that point, or certainly very badly affected. But they got him world-leading treatment. I mean, he meant he could recover quickly and didn't have to massively limit his game, and they're a major factor in his development. And you know, with KKR, you know, the two almost obvious examples are Shivam Mavi and Kamlesh Nagarkoti. Their players do get taken care of by their IPL franchises. They've been the IPL has been quick to say in this statement and in statements last week that getting players home safely, so that they are not exposed and so that the places they're going to aren't exposed, is a priority for them, and it's going to be the major use of their resources over the next few weeks and few days. So let us hope that all of those players going home, and all of those officials going home, and all of those ground staff and team staff going home get home safely, and that there is no further human cost to what has happened.
Yeah, let's hope for everyone's safety and they get home safe and sound. And I hope everyone takes care and takes precautions. Anyone watching, please take precautions. And thank you, Nakul, for joining me. If you can, go get vaccinated, everyone, please. And I hope to see you soon, Nakul, with some cricket somewhere down the line. Fingers crossed.
Thank you, Viraj.